Our speaker today is Kathryn Smith, whom I've known for a long time. Met her when her and her husband Leo, when we moved to Anderson. I've watched her children grow up. I can hardly believe that they are now parents themselves. It's amazing. Kathryn worked, when I met her, as a newspaper reporter for the Anderson Independent Mail. She was a reporter and editor, and she also was a tremendous influence in our community by becoming the executive director of the Cancer Association here in Anderson. And her legacy lives on in an incredible community of survivors and supporters of that agency. For the past 10 years, she has been writing and publishing books, giving phenomenal American history talks in character and sometimes not. She talks all over the East Coast and as far west as Texas. Today, she's going to talk about Prohibition in the South, the subject of her books, Baptists and Bootleggers, and Methodists and Moonshiners. Kathryn is a member of the Greater Anderson Rotary Club, of the club where I was once a member, and she's a dedicated Rotarian. So we're very glad to welcome her today. Thank you for being here, Kathryn.
Thank you, Julie. It's interesting that maternal and child health is the focus because you hear one of my grandchildren crying in the background. He just needs his nap. But I'm at Riceville Beach outside Wilmington, North Carolina, spending a few days with my daughter and her 3 children. So she's my tech whiz and has got me all hooked up on her laptop and even brought me in a glass of water and said, yeah, it's not gin, and in case I need a drink. Anyway, it's good to be with you. I'm going to ask y'all. I know where Julie is. I know that y'all are on a cruise ship. Lance, Lenore. Where else is everyone else? I know Dan's in Fort Mill. Yep. Where else are y'all zooming in from?
I'm down the road from Dan in Indian Land, and let's see, Shirley and Ken.
We're from Simpsonville.
Okay.
I'm in Duncan.
Also Indian Land.
Okay.
And Millie put in the chat, she's in McCormick.
Okay. All right. Well, Indian Land is an interesting place. I've given a couple of talks in Lancaster County recently, and of course that has a role in the Prohibition story. Actually, everywhere you live has a role in the Prohibition story. But let me start out with the Pilgrims. When the Pilgrims were landing in what would become America, they had a lot of issues on the way over, including a late start, a leaky boat that had to go back, bad weather, misdirection. And instead of landing in Virginia, they landed in Massachusetts. And they decided to pull ashore anyway because they were running out of beer. And that was the only thing they knew that was safe to drink. So if you see a cross section of the Mayflower, what you see is a ship full of barrels, and most of the barrels contain beer, some food provisions, but the water on board was only for the animals that were traveling with them to get eaten and stuff. So they pulled ashore so they could get their crops in the ground, get some beer going, and half of them died that winter anyway, which just shows you some of the bad decisions that have been made under the influence of alcohol in this country. But it goes on for there. Alcohol fueled lots of the daring do in the American Revolution. And when George Washington retired from the presidency, he went back to Mount Vernon and became the largest distiller in America. He had a Scotsman as his farm manager, a new farm manager, and he told him, I wish I could speak in brogue, but after he'd been on the job for about 20 minutes, he said, President Washington, you could make a whole lot more money grinding your grain you grow here into alcohol, distilling it into alcohol instead of selling it as flour. So George Washington, who was quite an astute businessman, unlike some of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, agreed to give it a go. In a small way, they set up a still in the cooperage where they made the barrels, and he made so much money in the first 6 months of this endeavor that he decided to go whole hog. He built a large, for the time, distillery of wood and stone. And in the last year of his life, they distilled 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey, which they sold unaged, what you'd call white dog today, to the taverns in Alexandria. And it became the largest profit center at Mount Vernon. Actually, they used all the crops they could spare at Mount Vernon and started buying from other farmers in the area. So it was a very successful endeavor. So George Washington was a social drinker. When he visited the South in 1791, he went all the way down the coast where he was the subject of toasts and parties and receptions and balls and everything you could imagine. Then he got all the way to Savannah, looped back up, and he actually came through what we call Indian land, spent, I think, 3 days in Lancaster County, and met with some Catawba Indian chiefs. He wanted his assurance that their land would not be lost to them under the new American government. And he kind of said, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's a state issue. I can't help you." And of course, we know what happened to the Catawba Indians as a result. But that's an aside. By the time another thing that George Washington implemented was the excise tax on whiskey, which was part of the way they were trying to raise money to pay off the debts of the Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to that. He got rid of the excise tax when he became president, and it did not return again until the Civil War. One of the results of that, and it was just one of the influences, that America became a land of drunkards. By 1830, and I can't remember who was in office then, Jackson maybe, or one of his followers, the average adult in the United States was drinking almost 3 times as much alcohol as we drink today. And if you've been to a college football game lately, that is probably just astonishing to think about. But we were a nation of drunkards. And it was also a time, of course, when women had no power. So it gave rise to a movement of temperance and suffrage. And two of the leaders were, one of the leaders was Susan B. Anthony. And they were really making a lot of progress. There was an organization that had membership all over what was then the United States, including South Carolina, called the George Washington Society, which was a forerunner of AA. Apparently, they were misinformed about George's distillery, but he was someone who was admired as being just of outstanding moral character, which he was. And that things were going along with that, and then along came the Civil War. And as I mentioned, needing more sources for income to pay for the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln returned the excise tax on alcohol and all other so-called luxury goods, pool tables, feathers, fancy carriages, and it became sort of an unpatriotic thing to tell people not to drink. So the temperance union fizzled out, and their members decided, okay, we'll work for abolition. That'll be our cause. Well, after the Civil War, when the South was finally welcomed back into the bosom of the nation, the people who had been making moonshine for generations in the homes in the South were all of a sudden being approached by revenue agents saying, "Oh, you've got to pay a tax on that stuff. We need the money to pay off the expenses of the Union Army," which you can imagine how well that went over at the time. And also the Temperance Union got going again in 1873. And the organization that galvanized it was a women's organization called the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it became active all over the South. The leader in South Carolina was a woman from Charleston whose brother had signed the Articles of Secession. But she felt that now was a time that women on both sides of the war could come together with a common enemy, which was demon alcohol. And that was the feeling all over the country at the time. That organization got going, working for temperance and suffrage. And then toward the end of the century, another organization got started called the Anti-Saloon League. as a historian, I'm always fascinated to look back in time to the echoes of today, or perhaps our echoes of what went on in time. But the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th was a very time of great anti-immigration fervor. And it was aimed at people like Germans and Italians and Irish who were had different customs. They had a different religion. They tended to be Catholic. They tended to drink beer as part of their custom, or drank wine, or if you're Irish, you drank everything. And the good Protestant people of the United States were anti-immigrant and pro-temperance, and they targeted, and the Anti-Saloon League especially targeted these immigrants. Once World War I got started, the Germans became even less popular, and that really gave the impetus for what became known as Prohibition. In 1918, as the war was winding down, Congress passed what was called the 18th Amendment. It was ratified in 1919, and it went into effect in January 1920. And there were all sorts of unintended consequences to Prohibition. Two of the things that stand out in my mind were a tremendous increase in crime, and the other one is NASCAR. So, the 20s showed a crime wave, the like of which the country had never seen before. The murder rate I don't have the percentage of increases, but the murder rate in big cities in the 20s is greater than it is today. And we think we've just got crime coming out the wazoo, but we had gang warfare. You had Al Capone, who not only was operating out of his base in Charleston, but came down south and settled in Miami Beach and was running all kinds of stuff, buying things all over the place. He bought liquor everywhere he could find it. People were smuggling it in from the coast, all the way from the tip of Florida, all the way up to Maine. It was coming in over the Canadian borders. And of course, here in the South, we were making it. We were really good at that. And we were supplying our own cities and also selling to big dealers like Capone and other gangs in the Northeast. So by the mid-1920s, the Prohibition movement was really losing some of its shine. But even so, there was a very powerful lobby, especially the Anti-Saloon League, which was actually a Methodist-based organization, which was interesting. I thought the Baptists were tougher on it. In fact, what's the joke? What's the difference in a Methodist and a Baptist? A Methodist will speak to you in the liquor store. Not at that time. Not at that time. Neither would speak to you, and there weren't any liquor stores because it was illegal. But finally, in 1928, Herbert Hoover got elected president, and he promised to investigate Prohibition, decide if it was working or not. He called it a noble experiment, seeing if this experiment was working or not, and then do whatever he could to either, well, he never said he'd try to get rid of it. But anyway, that satisfied some of his followers, but not all. And one of the people who was not happy about this at all was a woman from New York who had been a member of the National Republican Party, the board. She was the first woman on the board. She had started the National Republicans Women Organization. Her name was Pauline Morton. She was very wealthy. She was married to one of the richest men in America. Her middle name was Morton, which came from Morton Salt. So she was filthy rich. And she resigned from the Republican Party and started an organization called the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. And with her wealth and the wealth of her friends and their husbands, they pretty much bankrolled this organization, but they made it free for any woman in the country to join. So here you have Pauline, who is just gorgeous and beautifully groomed and well-spoken, and any housewife, shop girl, factory worker in the country could be part of her club. And they joined by the hundreds of thousands. So they were willing to do all kinds of grunt work out there, and she was their spokesman. By 32, it was obvious that Hoover was not going to change anything. In fact, the commission that he reported came back and said pretty much Prohibition is a disaster, it's not working, it's unenforceable, but we like it anyway, so let's keep it. And that was just the final straw for many, many people. And when the 1932 conventions came around, Pauline and her crew went to the Republicans, were given a very cool welcome. Then she went to the Democrats and they said, come on, we want to get rid of this thing. So she jumped parties, endorsed Franklin Roosevelt. And because a lot of things were going on, including the Great Depression, he was elected president in a landslide. One of my favorite statistics is that 98% of the voters in South Carolina voted for FDR in 1932. It was the highest percentage in the country. I always ask to myself, who were those 2% who voted for Hoover? And I think it had to have been postmasters, because at the time they were appointed by the president, and if Hoover lost their job, they lost theirs. And it was a pretty good sinecure to be a postmaster. So anyway, FDR came in. In 1933, he was inaugurated in March, which was the last time it was that late in the year. And he started what has become famously known the 100 Days, where 15 major pieces of legislation were passed: banking reform, agricultural reform, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And then he said, I think it's time to have a beer. So he sent up to Congress a piece of legislation called the Wine and Beer Revenue Act. And it modified the enabling legislation of Prohibition to allow for the sale of light beer and light wine. So 3.2% beer, what we even think of as near beer today. But that was the closest thing Americans had gotten to beer in a long time legally. So they got that passed in record time. Meanwhile, Congress had repealed the 18th Amendment by passing the 21st. And that was being ratified by the states. It was pushed through in a record time. And in December 1933, Prohibition came to an end. Now, kind of, because like a lot of other things, it was thrown back to the states. Same thing has happened with the abortion law today. And the states could make their own decisions about it. There was one state in the South that had pretty much never had prohibition. That was Louisiana. They ignored it the whole time. And then its next door neighbor didn't repeal prohibition until 1966. That's Mississippi. So some states decided to make alcohol sales only available through state-run and owned liquor stores. That's still the case in North Carolina. Others did licensing. In some of the southern states, it took them a while to get on board. I think in Georgia and South Carolina, it was about 1935 by the time their governor and legislature said, oh, okay, we'll legalize it again. And that's what it's been doing ever since. Oddly enough, the temperance folks did not give up. They continued trying to return prohibition for decades after that. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union has actually just kind of fizzled out in the last few years. Some of your grandmothers may have been members. They had their emblem was a little white ribbon, and they had all this elaborate jewelry. So you can imagine these ladies with big, broad bosoms of black and all these things going down. It's kind of like the DAR today. I'm sorry if anyone's in the DAR, but they do that too. So of course the prohibition ended, but moonshine continued, and that's when you get the other unintended consequence of prohibition, which was NASCAR. People had gotten a taste for that really harsh raw liquor, even the kind that might kill you because it's been, distilled through a radiator, a lead radiator. And in the mountains of the Carolinas and Georgia and other places, the moonshiners would hire these young boys. They'd soup up their Ford cars and they'd make runs down the mountains to the big cities of Atlanta and Greenville and Charlotte to sell the liquor. And then on off days, they would have races in fallow fields. And that led to stock car racing, which led to NASCAR. So many of the most famous NASCAR drivers like Junior Johnson had actually served time for running liquor. And that's very much tied to the history of NASCAR. So in my books, what I do is I tell you these stories through personalities for the most part. And some of the most fascinating people I have ever met are involved in this one way or another. I mentioned Pauline Morton Sabin, who was quite a woman, but there was also a woman on the other side named Carrie Nation, who was a radical. She was born in Kentucky, but when she was living in Kansas, which was dry by its constitution, and it still had saloons on every corner, she woke up one day, realized that God had told her to go out and destroy the saloons in town. So she and the Methodist minister got a bunch of rocks, wrapped them up in newspapers, took their hand organ with them, and burst into a saloon, playing, singing hymns, and throwing rocks. And then she graduated to the hatchet, which was much more lethal. And she did her hatchetations all over the country. She became famous and infamous. There's still bars that have signs that say, "Any nation welcome, but Carrie Nation." So I actually found Carrie Nation's birthplace while researching this book. It was in the middle of a cow pasture in Kentucky. The house is falling in, and that just shows you even something that's on the National Register does not have a guarantee for being preserved. But I also went to distilleries, I went to cemeteries, I went to a lot of cool museums. I rented a motorboat and went past Al Capone's house in Miami Beach. Found speakeasies here and there. And in the book, I tell you all the points I went to with websites. So you can follow my same trail through Prohibition. It's a lot of fun to write, a lot of fun to read, and every chapter has a cocktail recipe that's tied directly to the story I'm telling. So, any questions I can answer?
Wow. By the way, normally we encourage people to put questions in the chat, but I think at this point, just an open discussion would be
That'd be
really,
better. I'm
really
using a
wonderful.
computer I'm not familiar with.
But I do have one. It's more just a clarification, I guess. So when the early English settlers came and they were drinking 3 times more than we are now, which is hard to imagine.
And that's not the earliest settlers. That's until 1830. So the early ones were doing what they had done in Europe, which was drink light beer because the water was so dangerous.
Okay, so was it I'm getting the sense that it was the women's movement and the concern about the family and
it was very much
society that really was the catalyst for the Prohibition movement?
It was inspired by the Great Awakening, but also because women had no power. If you're married, you couldn't. If you had property you inherited from your father, if you married, you lost it. Your husband controlled everything. If you had an abusive husband who drank and he beat you and the children, if you left him, he got the children. They couldn't vote. And so the WCTU and the early women's movements were both about empowering women through suffrage, and then also with the alcohol as a tightly tied aim.
And clearly there was a big distinction between the near beer that everybody had been drinking in great quantities and then the proliferation of the distilled liquors here.
Yeah, right. So what George Washington was doing was what was starting to be done everywhere. Instead of making grain to make bread out of, they were distilling it. It was also a matter of survival for a lot of small farmers. It's bulky to transfer corn or take corn from a distance, but you could distill it down to alcohol, much more portable, much more barterable. You could barter with that. Everybody wanted it. And even a lot of farmers, that was what made the difference between they were, solvent or not, was that alcohol that they could make. So, other questions? Somebody else had their, yes.
Hi, Kathryn. Well, I admire your books. I read them all, especially the FDR. They're just amazing. And I'm going to buy this next one. My question is, where can I find it, and so I can get into it right away? The story is fascinating.
They're available on Amazon.
Okay.
And they're both in paperback now. They don't do Kindle books, unfortunately, but they are both in paperback on Amazon. They're published in Charleston by Evening Post Books. And you can also go to their website, but Amazon would probably get it to you quicker. So,
Oh
yeah,
yeah, I'm a Prime member, so
yeah,
I
yeah, buy a
and
lot of
uh,
books.
and I still love the papers, so the paper books.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Thank you. And since
So
you've got the
thank you.
cocktail recipes in them too, that kind of, and actually there are some mocktail recipes as tributes to folks like Carrie Nation. But as I say in the book, you can make them stand up a little better if you want to add some booze to the recipe.
Definitely, I'm gonna try one of those too. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Kathryn, we were in California a couple of years ago, and they were obviously wine was not something here in the South that
Yeah,
was a big thing, but they were talking about something about out there you could produce wine as long as it was for the church, and
exactly.
so, and so there were a lot of organizations that became very religious all of a sudden.
Yes. Yeah.
But it also provided a way, to get wine out to people. But I just wondered, was there any loopholes in the South
Yes.
for
There
anything
was
that?
there was a national loophole in the Prohibition enabling legislation, the Volstead Act, and one of them was, and that's one of the funniest parts I've got in Baptist and Bootleggers is what happened as a result. Um, it was wine could be used for religious sacraments. So obviously the Catholics, the Episcopalians, and also Jewish people use wine in their sacraments. So yeah, you were having a lot of rabbis popping up with last names like O'Shaughnessy and that kind of thing. And there was one who basically had a undercover liquor store in New York, and anyone who was buying from him was a member of his temple. So he had 2,000 members of his temple, and he's operating out of a 2-room apartment in Brooklyn. That was one of the loopholes. There was something about apple brandy or apple jack because of the apple farmers lobby. There were a couple of other loopholes, and they were huge. Oh, medicinal purposes. This was another one that American Medical Association had decided a few years before Prohibition began that there was no medicinal purpose for alcohol. After they discovered through the Volstead Act legislation that they would get paid for every prescription they wrote for medicinal alcohol, all of a sudden they discovered there were at least 27 uses for alcohol. W.C. Fields used to joke that he always carried a pint of whiskey around with him for medicinal purpose in case of snake bite, and he also carried a snake. Oh my. So, but I don't want to make too much. I mean, there's a lot of funny stuff about this, but I know we all have alcoholics in our family. My son had his life saved when he became a member of AA. So I write in the back of Methodist and Moonshiners about the new sober curious movements and the non-alcoholic bottle shops, a very successful one on King Street in Charleston then. And the start of AA, which was during the Great Depression, as someone who had become an alcoholic, Bob W. While he was working on the stock market, became an alcoholic, and he and a doctor started Alcoholics Anonymous together as a self-help group. And of course, it's been spectacularly successful for people all over the world. So there's that side of alcohol too. So we don't want to be too hard on the people who are fighting for temperance because they really thought they were going to do a world of good if they could clear up the alcohol, but you can't. Other questions?
Kathryn, I want to let you know that your book are great Christmas presents too, especially if you know Baptist and you know Methodist.
Yeah.
So Franca, you might want to think about, if you know some of those folks, that'd be great Christmas present.
Yeah. Thank you. I sell a lot at Christmas and Father's Day. Well, let me tell you quickly what I'm working on now. It's a straight cocktail book called Drinking with the Detectives. And it's an exploration of detective fiction from Edgar Allan Poe all the way to Louise Penny and James Patterson, and What the Detectives Drank. And I'm writing this book with a co-author in Connecticut named Ann Peck Davis. We've got an agent who's going to start shopping it around for us soon. So cross your fingers that I'll be able to come back and talk to you about that in a year or so.
That's good.
Really looking forward to that. I do have actually another question, and it's about sloe gin. I spent a lot of time in the woods in Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, and it was not uncommon to, in the middle of absolute nowhere, to come up on a stand of plum trees and see a whole bunch of, I wish I'd kept them, a whole bunch of old mason jars laying around, and maybe even a still here and there. So, the was that also common for them to plant the fruit trees to?
It's an interesting question. Plum brandy. I mean, you can make brandy out of anything, and I don't know. I've drunk sloe gin, but I really don't know what it is. It's distilled from plums?
I think so. It's SLOE, and so I think there's a type of plum that so, okay. Curious. Yeah, I'm really wishing I'd kept those mason jars now. They'd probably be worth a lot more.
Something. But yeah, I don't think that's at all unlikely. In addition to making rye whiskey, George Washington at his still also made brandy, peach and apple brandy, and this sounds really disgusting, but persimmon brandy. So in smaller amounts, but the rye whiskey was the big thing. And brandies were very popular at the time. George Washington's favorite alcohol was Madeira wine. And one of his granddaughters said that sometimes he would have 3 glasses after dinner, but they served it in glasses like this, just tiny glasses. We're used to these great big bulbous glasses that hold like half a bottle of wine today. And then George Washington, being as big a man as he was, and he was 6'4", had huge hands and feet. I imagine he could hold quite a lot of alcohol. And he had a world of troubles during the Revolutionary War with drunken soldiers and officers, and his employees also. So he was very aware of the downside of alcohol.
I guess I would say that given the conditions of the time, that alcohol was one of the ways they actually just managed to get through the day, whether it's the sailors on those old ships or soldiers or whatever.
Having a portion of rum was very important. And at Valley Forge, when they were dying of everything else, they doubled the rum portion. So rum was the big drink then. Rot gut. Yes.
Yes, Kathryn, can you give us a little bit of a history of the book publishing industry and your experience and any fun things that have happened?
Well, I guess I've been all over the map with it. And I published my first book, the biography of Marguerite LaHanne, called The Gatekeeper. She was FDR's private secretary when I was 60 years old. And just some connections I made and a lot of really dumb luck got me an agent in New York who sold it to an imprint of Simon & Schuster. From there, Simon & Schuster rejected my next book proposal, but it was published by a regional publisher in Charleston, Evening Post Books, and they published that in both the Prohibition books. I self-publish a mystery series, which has Misty LaHanne as a private an amateur detective. She's like the Nancy Drew of the New Deal. I self-published that as a Kindle and paperback book on Amazon with a friend of mine named Kelly Durham, Kelly Durham. And then Anne and I, my co-author in Drinking with Detectives, are trying to get a national publisher for our book because we think it would merit national distribution. And our agent's real enthusiastic about it. Themed cocktail books are very big right now. You may have noticed. So it's just all over the map. I think the thing that I had been warned about is that editors and agents quickly change jobs. And so the editor that I had at Simon & Schuster had been there 7 years. Right before the book came out, she went to a different publisher. And I was put under an editor who was nice, but just not very enthusiastic about my work. So I lost that friend at Simon & Schuster. or that champion, because an editor is the one who convinces the publisher to buy your property and then works with you and promotes you and kind of shepherds you through. My co-author Anne had been with another publisher. Her agent had left the agency and gone into some line of work. No one at the agency wanted to represent her anymore. It's just, you know, it's not easy. Self-publishing is easy, but it's hard to sell your books with self-publishing. So
Congratulations.
yeah, you know, it's no way to make a living, but it's a lot of fun. And any other questions I can answer?
Just real quick, Kathryn, I've only read like one article, so this is very surface information, but it seems like there's a decrease in younger people drinking right now.
There is,
And
and there's an increase in older people.
yeah, it has, for the decrease in younger people, have we seen anything like that in history that you know of where people have backed off of drinking on their own?
Well, in Prohibition, there was definitely a decrease in drinking because a lot of people were just going to be law abiding anyway. I don't know. I hadn't researched that. I think, you know, a lot of young people have just switched to pot, basically, as it's become more and more available. So they may not be drinking, but they're chewing their gummies. So
Gotcha.
It's interesting, Kathryn, that you mentioned the transition to pot because there again, spending some time out in the woods in a particular part of the country, instead of seeing the old stills, you started to run across little pot.
very much so. And you know, it's also the focus of the
portable, you know, pretty easy to hide, you know, where you don't have smoke coming up from a still out in the woods. So it from a practical standpoint, it actually made a lot of economic sense to make the switch if you're producing it.
Yeah. Well, and that also happened with once people stopped making as much moonshine and they switched to pot and then they switched to meth. And the focus of the, you know, local sheriff's departments immediately switched along with it. You know, they weren't busting stills up anymore, but they were finding pot, and they were finding people with meth labs and, you know, whatever new drug came along, crack, they were busting on that. So people are always going to find a way to get away from reality.
I see an opportunity here. Kathryn, you are so inspiring, but my brain is spinning and I'm looking forward to a fellowship program where we share our own toasts with whatever, whether it's sober curious or not. And I would be really interested to see what people select to share. And I suspect some of those recipes will come from your book.
Okay.
Would be great.
There are a million recipes out there.
Well, I think a particular focus could be on the recipes in your book, frankly. That's where I was going to go.
Well, I'd be glad to join y'all virtually or in person because I've got children in Fort Mill, a child and grandchildren in Fort Mill. So I'm always glad to have an opportunity to come up to that part of the state.
You know what? I think we can make that happen.
Okay.
That would be wonderful. And then zooming in from Anderson. Absolutely. Yep. Okay. We'll make it happen. Any other just comments, questions about this whole topic? Actually, anybody have any experience with moonshining or any of that? Ken, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to just ask the other side of this story of, so do you deal with why do people drink?
No, there are plenty of other books that do that. So I kind of tried to stay in my wheelhouse of the laws. And also, let me mention about how I got onto this topic at all. You mentioned my father, Lance Bruce Yandel, who was a and it always makes me seem so much younger than I am to say that I still have a living father, but he's 92. He still writes, he still does speaking, and he probably would be glad to come in and do a Zoom with y'all on the economy. But my father and my son, Adam Smith, are both economists too, and professors. Or Dad's retired. Adam teaches at Johnson & Wales in Charlotte. And they wrote a book together a few years ago called Bootleggers and Baptists, which is based on my father's theory of economic regulation, government regulation. And he came up with the name because both bootleggers and Baptists are opposed to legal sales of alcohol on Sundays. The bootleggers because it opens up the market to them. The Baptists because it's a sin to drink on Sunday and any other day, but especially on Sunday. And they did a book of case studies together when they're 50 years apart in age. And I was just so excited and so proud of them. I was telling everybody I knew about this wonderful book called Bootleggers and Baptists. And as soon as I got the title out, somebody would say, "Ooh, that sounds like a fun book." And I'd have to say, "It's an economics book. It's not a lot of fun, but it's really interesting." And then I thought, well, what if I wrote a fun book with the same title? So to avoid confusion, I flipped the title. And because I didn't want someone to get my book by mistake and think, what are cocktail recipes doing in a economics book, or get theirs and say, well, where are the cocktail recipes? And I don't know that that's happened. It may have happened to a couple of people, but I didn't hear about it. But anyway, so that, and then after I did Baptist and Bootleggers, I heard so many stories in other places I hadn't gotten to because I researched it during COVID, and I had to go to places where they didn't have COVID outbreaks. So I had not done much for Virginia or North Carolina and some of the other areas. So I did some mopping up and just had a whole lot more fun stories that wound up in that. And so people keep saying, well, are you going to do something for the Presbyterians? And I said, no, the only thing I could think would be Presbyterians and prostitutes, and I'm just not interested in that form of sin. So drinking with the detectives will be my next steps option.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
I had another question, and it just went.
Now you forgot.
About blue laws. For example, anybody who's in the South for any length of time has experienced places where you just can't buy even beer and wine or especially liquor on Sundays. It's eased up a little bit, but is the county that Jack Daniels is in, Lynchburg, Tennessee, is still a dry county?
It is a county, and I write about that in Methodist and Moonshiners. I went to what I call Jack Daniels land. This is very much to the benefit of the Jack Daniels Company, which employs almost everybody in that county, because the only place you can buy liquor is at the store of, and it's called a souvenir bottle of liquor. You can buy a ticket. It used to be if you had went on a tour, they served you lemonade because they couldn't even do tasting. But now they have an educational tasting of whiskey. So you can do a dry tour at Jack Daniels or a wet tour. They do allow beer to be sold in restaurants. Partly because Jack Daniels sponsors a big country music festival every year, and they reason that you've got to be able to drink beer at a country restaurant festival. There is a very small distillery and winery, and they sell wine by the bottle at their store. You could take it into a restaurant. So it's a dry county pretending to be a wet county, but they do not have any liquor stores. Yeah.
I think this has been one of the most, not just fascinating, but fun programs we have. I think we all have in the topic at some level or another. It does touch all of us.
Yes, it does. Well, anyway, I plan to be at the awards banquet. I hope I'll see some of you there.
Yeah, I think you will. One thing I do want to say, and I think you have visited us before, so you're not a complete stranger to this, but we have some wonderful people in our club who select a book in honor of the speaker each week, and it's very carefully selected to be relevant to the program. And this one is yours. And it will go in a little free library somewhere
Oh, I
upstate
love that.
dedicated to you. And it's called
Aw,
How to Write a Story. And
I
it
love
guides
that.
young storytellers through the joys and challenges of the writing process, which clearly you're very much aware of. This empowering picture book breaks down the writing process to encourage kids to explore their own creativity. And
Mm.
who knows, this book could indeed inspire the next.
Oh, that is so cool. And I just got my grandchildren, I just got some books out of a little free library here at Wrightsville Beach yesterday. So I can't pass one without stopping in and perusing. That is so neat. Thank you very much.